"So you're stupid, Dad." The words hit Clarence Monroe like a sudden gust of wind, sharp and jarring. The morning sun slanted through the kitchen blinds, illuminating the fine dust particles that floated lazily in the air, as if the world itself had paused to witness the scene. Darius Monroe, his son, stood across the kitchen table, chest heaving, eyes blazing with arrogance and defiance. A glass of water trembled in his hand, the condensation rolling down the sides like a silent warning. Then, with a snap of reckless anger, the glass hurtled across the small kitchen. Water struck Clarence squarely in the face, dripping down his forehead, beard and shoulders. The cold shock should have enraged him, should have sparked a defensive gesture, a retort. Yet Clarence Monroe, 70, bald-headed with a long grey beard framing his calm, composed face, merely blinked once and allowed the water to run off. He did not raise his voice. He did not flinch. He simply smiled, a small knowing curve of the lips that carried the weight of decades. Darius froze for a moment, chest rising and falling rapidly. His eyes, wide with disbelief, scanned his father's face. No anger, no shout, no confrontation. Just a serene, almost unsettling calm. The arrogance that had built itself over the years, the belief that wealth, youth and aggression could bend the world, was met with an unshakable wall of patience. I can't believe you're just standing there," Darius stammered, the words breaking into a whisper. His pride, the armor that had always protected him, now seemed flimsy and threadbare. He had thought humiliation would provoke reaction, would break his father's composure. But instead, it only drew a quiet power from the older man, a presence that could not be shaken by a thrown glass, by raised voice, or by a moment of reckless rage. Clarence Monroe reached slowly into his pocket, pulling out a small, sleek phone. The gesture was deliberate, unhurried, the kind that spoke volumes about self-control. He dialed one number, his movements precise, measured. Darius watched, confusion knitting his brows. What are you doing?" he demanded, still trembling, still standing at a distance, trying to assert dominance that was slipping from his grasp. Clarence said nothing. He did not need to. The silence itself carried authority. The phone pressed to his ear. He listened for a moment, nodding slightly, voice low and calm in response. It was a conversation that would alter the course of the morning, the day, and perhaps the weeks to come. A ripple that Darius could not yet comprehend. The kitchen remained still, save for the water pooling on the tiled floor, the sunlight catching droplets like shattered diamonds. Darius took a step forward, then another, his confidence wavering. The arrogance that had fueled his every action, the shouting, the threats, the insults, faltered under the weight of the father's calm demeanor. He wanted a reaction, any reaction, but it never came. He felt like a child caught in a storm he could not control. Minutes passed in taut silence. The world seemed suspended between the cold floor tiles and the commanding presence of Clarence Monroe. Then, without any fanfare, Clarence hung up the phone. He placed it gently back in his pocket, his gaze locking with his son's. A calm, measured gaze that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. The lesson had begun. Darius's hands shook, not from fear of physical harm, but from the realization that he was facing a force far stronger than his rage. Unwavering wisdom and the patient strategy of a man who had lived 7 decades mastering life's balances. His mind raced, trying to anticipate what might happen next, but every thought was met with the unrelenting calm of his father. The arrogance that had always shielded him now offered no refuge. In the quiet kitchen, the water on the floor, the trembling hands of the son, and the serene figure of the father created a tableau of inevitable reckoning. Every neighbor's window reflected the sunlight in golden streaks, and every droplet seemed to pulse with tension. The moment was cinematic, not in the loud crashes or dramatic shouts, but in the stillness, in the subtle gestures, in the quiet intensity of a lesson that Darius had refused to heed for too long. 30 minutes later, Darius would understand the full weight of what had begun in that silent kitchen. But for now he remained frozen, a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a dawning realization slowly settling in. He could feel it creeping in, the understanding that he had underestimated the patience, the foresight, and the quiet authority of his father. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long dramatic shadows across the kitchen floor, Clarence Monroe's calm smile lingered. It was not a smile of malice. It was not a gloating expression. It was the quiet, terrifying power of someone who knows that the smallest, most deliberate actions, a phone call, a note, a gesture, can have consequences far greater than any shout or slap ever could. Darius's jaw tightened. His pride would not let him speak. His body trembled. His mind churned. And all the while the father remained silent. Long grey beard catching the morning light, an unshakable pillar in a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar and frightening. The storm had begun, and Darius Munro would not escape its first waves. The minutes ticked by like slow, deliberate drum beats, each one echoing in Darius Munro's mind. He sat on the edge of the kitchen counter, legs dangling, hands still wet from the glass he had thrown. The sting of the water on his face had long faded, but the humiliation remained, thick and suffocating. He could feel his pride unraveling, each thread pulled by the realization that his father, Clarence Munro, had not flinched, had not reacted, had simply smiled and taken action that Darius could not yet comprehend. Outside, the suburban street hummed with quiet life. Cars drove by lazily. Neighbors moved along their routines, completely unaware of the storm unfolding behind the closed kitchen door. Inside, the tension was palpable. Darius's chest heaved with every ragged breath. The arrogance that had carried him for decades, the belief that youth, wealth, and authority could bend anyone to his will, had crumbled entirely in 30 short minutes. Clarence Munro, standing a few steps away from the counter, finally moved. His long grey beard shimmered faintly in the morning sunlight, filtering through the blinds. He did not shout, he did not berate, he did not scold. He walked to the doorway with the steady, measured pace of a man who had lived 70 years mastering control over his emotions, actions, and consequences. His hand brushed against the doorknob casually. Yet there was nothing casual about the air he carried, a presence that demanded respect, a calm that overpowered chaos. Darius stared at his father, wide-eyed, trying to anticipate a reaction, a sign of anger, a threat, anything that would allow him to regain some semblance of control. But Clarence Munro gave him nothing. The silence was heavier than any shout, more punishing than any physical blow. It was a weight of authority forged over decades, tested in life's most difficult moments, and refined to perfection. Then came the subtle shift. Clarence reached for his phone again. His fingers moved with deliberate precision, dialing a number Darius would never forget. The gesture was simple, almost casual, but Darius sensed the gravity immediately. Every fiber of his being tensed, a chill running down his spine. The arrogance, the pride, the false sense of control that had defined him, was slipping away with each passing second. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of a nearby oak tree, sending dappled sunlight across the tiled kitchen floor, where the water from the thrown glass shimmered. Darius's mind raced, trying to anticipate the next move, trying to reason with the reality that was rapidly closing in around him. His phone vibrated in his pocket with notifications he couldn't check, emails that couldn't wait, and calls that might as well have been warnings from the universe itself. Clarence's voice finally broke the silence, low, calm, unhurried. Darius, understand this. The moment you choose disrespect, the consequences follow swiftly. Patience is a weapon you have underestimated, and foresight is one you have ignored. You have been given lessons before, yet you refuse to learn. This is the culmination of what you sowed. Darius swallowed hard, trembling, feeling an unfamiliar sensation, fear. Not fear of physical harm, but fear of losing everything he had built, everything he had assumed was unshakable. His bank accounts, his investments, his so-called power, his social image, all rested on illusions that his father could dismantle with quiet precision. The next 30 minutes would seal the lesson. Clarence's phone call had been made. The wheels were already in motion. Darius, for the first time, realized that his father's calm demeanor was not weakness but strategic mastery. Each step, each gesture, each moment of silence had been deliberate, a calculated orchestration designed to humble, to teach, to restore balance. Sweat rolled down Darius's temples, mixing with the cold droplets still clinging to his face. He tried to speak, tried to regain control, but the words died in his throat. His mind raced. How did he know? What did he do? What is happening? The panic was visceral, almost tangible, as if the air itself pressed down on him. Clarence Munro moved toward the window. Looking out briefly, his gaze unwavering, assessing the world beyond his home, as though anticipating the arrival of consequences. Darius could see the sunlight glinting off the long grey beard, each strand a reminder of patience, wisdom, and unshakable authority. And then, it began. The first alerts pinged on Darius's phone. Confused numbers, alerts from the bank, notifications from services he relied on. He stared, heart pounding, as he realized the immensity of what had been set in motion. He tried to comprehend, tried to react, tried to bargain, but it was too late. The tide of consequences had already begun, orchestrated with silent precision by the man he had mocked, ridiculed, and struck only 30 minutes before. Darius's knees weakened. He sank slightly against the kitchen counter, his hands gripping the edge for stability. The shock was slow building, crushing. Each notification was another strike, another step toward understanding that his world, his arrogance, and his sense of superiority were no match for his father's patience and foresight. Clarence Monroe finally returned to the center of the room, eyes fixed on his son. The long grey beard glinted faintly in the morning sunlight. He said nothing more, only nodded slightly, a subtle affirmation that the first part of the lesson had begun. Darius Monroe, humbled, trembling, and utterly powerless, had finally begun to understand the weight of his actions, the reach of his father's quiet authority, and the inevitability of the consequences now unfolding. The next 30 minutes would change everything. By the time the clock struck the half-hour mark, Darius would be forced to confront reality, stripped bare of pride, forced to acknowledge the deliberate, unstoppable power of a father who had never raised his voice but commanded respect through sheer wisdom. Patience and calculated action, and in that calm kitchen, the tension was nearly unbearable, the silence heavy with unspoken lessons. Darius's sobs threatened to break through, but his pride fought stubbornly, until the first wave of consequences struck, and with it, the realization that Clarence Monroe's calm demeanor had been the most powerful weapon he had ever faced. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked loudly, each second dragging Darius Monroe deeper into panic. His fingers shook as he clutched the edge of the counter, trying to steady his racing mind. The glass of water that had splashed across his father's face seemed almost symbolic now, a trivial act compared to the storm Clarence Monroe had quietly unleashed. 30 minutes had passed since that small, deliberate act of patience, and Darius had no idea how swiftly his world would unravel. Outside the house, the morning sun had climbed higher, painting the suburban street in sharp contrasts of light and shadow. Darius's phone continued to vibrate relentlessly, notifications he dared not check, piling up like ominous warnings. Every app, every account, every connection he relied on had begun to betray him. His pride, the armor that had shielded him through years of arrogance, was crumbling under the weight of consequences he could neither predict nor prevent. Clarence Monroe, his long grey beard catching the sunlight, remained perfectly calm. His presence was almost magnetic, the kind that forced reflection without a single word. Darius's eyes darted to him repeatedly, trying to glean some hint of mercy, some indication that he could regain control, but there was nothing. The serenity in his father's gaze was unnerving, a mirror reflecting the sun's flaws back at him in the harshest clarity. The first signs of collapse began with Darius's digital empire. Notifications from banking apps flashed in rapid succession. Transfers that were meant to go through failed. Investments froze mid-execution. Credit lines were suspended. The very tools he had relied upon to assert dominance in his life now betrayed him. His attempts to call, to plead, to reverse the damage were met with error messages and unreachable lines. It was as if the universe itself, guided by Clarence's calm hand, had conspired to level the scales. Darius stumbled backward, catching himself on the counter. Sweat rolled down his temples, and his breath came in shallow, rapid bursts. The arrogance that had once fueled his every decision now felt like a lead weight, dragging him into an abyss of fear and humiliation. He had underestimated his father, dismissed his calm as weakness, and now the consequences were impossible to ignore. Clarence Monroe finally moved, his steps deliberate. Each footfall was measured, echoing softly against the tile floor. He did not speak, but his eyes met his son's in a gaze that conveyed more authority than words ever could. Darius felt the weight of those decades, Years of experience, of patience, of strategic foresight pressed down upon him. Every insult, every act of defiance, every moment of disrespect had been catalogued and quietly counted. And now the reckoning had arrived. Darius's trembling hands flew to his phone again, but it was too late. The full scope of Clarence's plan was visible in every screen, every account, every notification. His financial foundation had collapsed in mere minutes. But the humiliation did not end there. Messages had been sent, calls had been made, and his network of colleagues, clients, and friends was already receiving updates that would forever alter their perception of him. The facade of power and control he had built over decades was crumbling, leaving nothing but vulnerability. For a fleeting moment, Darius's mind grasped at defiance, trying to rationalize, to argue, to reclaim control. But each thought was countered by the unshakable calm of his father. Each mental plea, each flicker of hope, collided with the realization that Clarence Monroe's strategy was flawless. It was not brute force. It was not anger. It was precision, patience, and foresight, a methodical dismantling of pride with surgical accuracy. The sound of distant sirens punctuated the morning, a reminder that the consequences were not confined to private humiliation, but extended into public accountability. Darius froze, realizing that even his social standing, once unassailable, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Colleagues would talk, neighbors would whisper, and the world he had believed was his domain was no longer under his control. Clarence Monroe approached the kitchen table slowly, hands clasped behind his back, eyes locked on his son. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. His presence alone conveyed the full measure of authority and judgment. Darius's shoulders slumped, the last vestiges of his arrogance dissolving under the weight of the unspoken message. True power lies not in shouting or anger, but in patience, wisdom, and deliberate action. By now, Darius's body shook uncontrollably. His knees buckled slightly, forcing him to lean against the counter. He had never felt so powerless, so exposed, so utterly small in front of another human being. The man he had called stupid had demonstrated a wisdom and strength that words could not convey, a mastery of strategy that left the son reeling, and then it happened. The final notifications arrived, each one a hammer blow to pride, to control, to illusion. Darius's bank accounts were frozen, important transfers declined, and key associates had been alerted of discrepancies in his behavior. In 30 short minutes, the world he had built on arrogance and entitlement had unraveled entirely. Darius slumped onto the kitchen chair, head in hands, trembling. The sobs came slowly at first, then with increasing intensity, until his voice broke and echoed against the walls of the house. He was crying like a child, stripped of the shields that had once made him feel invincible. Every attempt to regain control failed, every thought of defiance dissolved into panic, and every ounce of pride was shattered. Clarence Monroe stood silently, his long grey beard glowing faintly in the sunlight. He did not speak. He did not intervene. He simply allowed the lesson to unfold, confident that Darius would absorb it fully, painfully and irrevocably. The silence itself was the most powerful tool, more devastating than any shout, more instructive than any lecture. For Darius Monroe, 30 minutes of reckless arrogance had culminated in a lifetime of lessons compressed into an unbearable morning. He would not forget this. He could not forget this. And the seed of true humility, planted carefully by his father, had finally begun to take root. The morning sun had fully climbed above the rooftops, spilling golden light across the Monroe residence, but inside the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Darius Monroe remained slumped in the kitchen chair, shoulders shaking, his mind a whirlwind of fear, shame, and disbelief. The sobs that had begun 30 minutes ago had subsided into quiet, ragged breaths, yet the echo of humiliation lingered like a thick fog. His world, once so solid, was now fracturing in ways he could neither control nor anticipate. Clarence Monroe, standing a few steps away, long grey beard catching the sunlight, exuded a calmness that seemed almost otherworldly. He had taken no overt action since making that first phone call, yet every ripple of consequence could be traced back to him. It was not force, not confrontation, not loud argument. It was strategy, patience, and quiet authority, the kind of mastery that only a life lived with dignity, discipline, and foresight could produce. Darius's hands trembled as he reached for his phone once again. Notifications flashed across the screen. Banking alerts, missed calls, emails, and messages that detailed the sudden suspension of privileges, accounts, and access. Every message, every ping, was a hammer striking at his pride, his ego, and the carefully constructed illusion of control he had always relied upon. He scrolled frantically, trying to comprehend the scope of the damage, each revelation a gut punch that left him increasingly paralyzed. His breathing grew more shallow, more erratic. The arrogance that had defined him for decades was dissolving, leaving behind only the raw core of vulnerability. For the first time in his life, Darius Monroe felt powerless, utterly, completely powerless. And the irony was almost cruel. The man he had mocked, insulted, and thrown water at, the man he had called stupid, had orchestrated this collapse with a single phone call. A quiet presence and unwavering calm, Clarence Monroe finally stepped closer, his gaze steady and unwavering. He did not speak, for he did not need to. His silence carried weight far beyond what words could achieve. Darius's mind raced, attempting to predict what his father might do next, what punishment might be imminent. But every instinct, every expectation, was thwarted by the serenity of the man standing before him. It was a silence that demanded reflection, introspection, and surrender. Outside, a car horn blared in the distance, and Darius flinched at the sound. His mind, still consumed with fear and panic, connected every outside noise to his own unraveling reality. The network of friends, colleagues, and acquaintances he had relied upon for validation had begun to feel alien, distant, judgmental. Each beep and notification was a reminder that his arrogance and disrespect had consequences far beyond the walls of his home. He tried to speak, tried to demand an explanation, tried to argue that none of this was fair. "Dad, this isn't—" "You can't—" His voice faltered, breaking under the weight of panic and despair. Clarence Monroe's gaze met his son's, calm and unwavering, and Darius felt the true weight of a lifetime of wisdom pressing down on him. There was no room for bargaining, no room for excuses, only the consequences of choices made recklessly, impulsively, and without respect. Then came the next wave. Darius's colleagues began to call, leaving confused and concerned messages. Bank representatives were on the line, their voices firm and transactional, confirming freezes, declines, and account alerts. His social reputation, built over years of calculated image crafting, was now under scrutiny, vulnerable to whispers, judgments, and speculation. Every foundation Darius had relied upon was shaken, not by force or confrontation, but by the quiet, deliberate strategy of a father who understood power differently. Darius sank lower into the chair, sweat beading on his forehead, fingers clutching at the edge of the counter like a lifeline. For the first time, he understood the true magnitude of his father's patience and strategy. He realized that every insult, every act of defiance, every moment of pride had been catalogued, remembered, and countered with a precision that left no room for error. Clarence Monroe's quiet authority had transformed the kitchen into a courtroom, and the evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and devastating. A faint knock at the door startled Darius. He looked up to see nothing but sunlight and shadows at first, yet the sound of the knock resonated in his chest like a warning bell. Clarence Monroe remained motionless, beard glinting, eyes calm. The knock was followed by another and another. Darius's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling. What was happening now? What new humiliation awaited him? What had his father orchestrated that he could not yet see? Then realization hit. Each call, each notification, each subtle shift orchestrated by his father had been moving toward a single, inescapable point. Exposure. Public, private, personal, and financial exposure. Darius's arrogance had led him to believe he could intimidate, belittle, and dominate the one person who had shaped him. And yet, the man he had disrespected was now controlling the narrative with an invisible hand, guiding the consequences to their inevitable culmination. Darius Monroe collapsed into himself, a mix of despair, panic, and dawning humility washing over him. The sobs returned, ragged and uncontrollable, echoing against the walls of the kitchen. For the first time, he saw his father not as an obstacle, not as an authority figure to resist, but as a force, measured, deliberate, and unstoppable. Every action, Every moment of patience, every silent gesture had been building toward this crescendo. Clarence Monroe remained still, long grey beard catching the sunlight in a halo-like glow, calm and unwavering. He did not move, he did not speak. He allowed the consequences to unfold naturally, confident that the lesson would be internalized fully, painfully and irrevocably. Darius's pride, his illusions, his arrogance, all were stripped away in those 30 minutes of strategic, silent justice. And as the morning stretched toward noon, Darius Monroe understood something profound, terrifying and humbling. Humility, respect, and patience wielded with wisdom are far stronger than anger, pride, or impulsive action. He had learned this lesson at the cost of his arrogance, his ego, and his false sense of control. And the storm that had begun with a glass of water in the kitchen was only just reaching its full, devastating effect. Darius Monroe's world had turned inside out in the span of 30 minutes. What had begun as a minor act of defiance, calling his father stupid and throwing water in his face, had evolved into a tidal wave of consequences he could neither comprehend nor escape. The kitchen, once a familiar, controlled space, now felt alien, suffocating, and heavy with tension. His hands trembled uncontrollably, his chest heaved and sweat poured down his face, dripping into his eyes, stinging like the cold truth he could no longer deny. Clarence Monroe, standing a few feet away, remained the embodiment of calm. His long grey beard caught the light filtering through the blinds, shimmering like threads of patience, wisdom, and calculated authority. He did not move hastily, did not raise his voice, and did not berate his son. Every moment of silence, every measured step, every unspoken gesture carried weight far beyond what Darius could fathom. It was a power refined over 70 years, a mastery of patience and strategy that left even the most arrogant soul exposed. Darius tried to speak. Words caught in his throat. "Dad, I don't understand." What is happening?" His voice was shaky, fragmented by panic, disbelief, and shame. He searched his father's calm face for a hint, a clue, anything that might offer a way out of the chaos engulfing him. But Clarence Monroe's gaze was unwavering, steady, and merciless in its composure. The silent message was clear. The consequences were not arbitrary. They were deliberate, and they were complete. Notifications continued to flood Darius's phone. Banking alerts, missed calls, declined transfers, and account freezes piled up relentlessly. Each ping struck like a hammer on his pride. Even as he attempted to regain control, every action he took only emphasized the futility of resistance. Every connection he had relied upon, colleagues, friends, financial networks, was now compromised, subtly manipulated by Clarence's carefully orchestrated plan. It was not magic. It was strategy. It was patience. It was the quiet execution of power that Darius had never learned to respect. The sobs returned, louder this time, mingled with gasps and trembling. Darius's knees buckled, forcing him to collapse fully onto the cold kitchen tile. He covered his face with his hands, trying to hide from the relentless reality of humiliation and failure. The arrogance that had fueled him for decades had dissolved entirely, leaving a raw, vulnerable core exposed to the consequences of his impulsive behavior. Clarence Monroe took a slow step closer. The weight of 70 years seemed to press down from his shoulders. "Darius," he said, voice calm but resolute, "you sought to humiliate me, to assert control where you had none. You believed your youth and anger could bend me to your will. But every action carries a consequence. Every insult, every act of defiance, every reckless word has a ripple." Darius's breath caught in his throat. The words stung more than any physical blow. They cut deeper than a slap, deeper than the water he had thrown moments before. He realized with crushing clarity that the man before him had orchestrated every outcome, anticipated every misstep, and delivered justice not through confrontation, but through patience, foresight, and precision. The next wave of consequences hit him mercilessly. His colleagues began calling, curious and concerned. Emails, voicemails, and social media messages piled up, exposing errors, inconsistencies, and behaviors that had been meticulously tracked. Clients questioned him. Friends withdrew. His reputation, the facade of control and dominance he had curated, disintegrated before his eyes. It was as if the world itself had aligned with Clarence Monroe's strategy. ensuring that every reckless action by Darius would be met with its inevitable counter. Darius tried to flee, to escape, to salvage some semblance of control, but there was nowhere to hide. Each room, each corner, each step reminded him of his vulnerability, his failure, and the inevitability of judgment. The very foundation of his life, the pride, the arrogance, the sense of invincibility, and had crumbled, leaving him utterly exposed. And then Clarence Monroe reached out, placing a steady hand on his son's shoulder. The gesture was calm, deliberate, and commanding. "It is done, Darius," he said softly. "Now you see what arrogance, disrespect, and impulsive anger bring. Reflection, humility, and respect are not lessons you can ignore." Darius could not speak. He could only weep, sobbing uncontrollably as the realization sank in. He was powerless. He was humiliated. And he was entirely at the mercy of the quiet, deliberate authority of the father he had sought to belittle. The kitchen, once a scene of everyday life, had transformed into a chamber of reckoning. The water from the thrown glass had dried into faint puddles, reflecting sunlight and shadows like the fractured remnants of Darius's pride. The air was thick with tension, remorse, and revelation. Each tick of the clock echoed the inevitability of justice, the inescapable power of patience, and the devastating clarity of calculated consequences. Darius Monroe, finally, began to understand the magnitude of what he had provoked. The anger, arrogance, and entitlement that had defined him were now replaced with fear, humility, and an acute awareness of the quiet, unstoppable power of his father. Clarence Monroe did not need to shout, did not need to punish physically, did not need to humiliate publicly. The lesson had been delivered with precision, and the aftermath was unavoidable. By the end of the morning, Darius's sobs had grown quieter, more reflective. He remained on the kitchen floor, knees drawn close, body trembling, yet inside a seed of realization had begun to grow. The man he had insulted, mocked, and struck had demonstrated that true power lies not in anger, force, or dominance, but in patience, foresight, and deliberate action. And as Clarence Monroe, long grey beard glinting in the sunlight, stood silently watching, it became painfully clear to Darius the life he had known, built on arrogance and entitlement, would never be the same again. He was broken, humbled, and fully exposed. A child in front of the wisdom, strategy, and authority of the father he had so foolishly underestimated. The sun was high now, pouring a golden haze into the Monroe kitchen, yet the room felt heavier than ever. Darius Monroe remained on the tile floor, trembling, eyes wide with disbelief and cheeks wet from tears. His entire world, pride, arrogance, and the illusion of control, had collapsed in the span of an hour. Each notification, each call, each subtle ripple orchestrated by Clarence Monroe had dismantled the life Darius had built with such arrogance. Clarence stood silently, long grey beard glinting faintly in the sunlight. He had said very little throughout the morning, but every step, every gesture, every moment of patient calculation had communicated far more than words ever could. Darius had learned the devastating lesson. True authority lies in calm strategy, foresight, and the ability to remain unshaken when others rage. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with life, oblivious to the storm that had raged behind the kitchen door. But for Darius, every sound, the chirping of birds, the distant traffic, even the faint rustle of leaves, seemed magnified, reminders that the consequences were now irreversibly public. He could not escape the realization that Clarence Monroe's silent authority had reached beyond the walls of the home, impacting business associates, social connections, and personal reputation. Darius tried once more to rise, to speak, to appeal for mercy, but his limbs refused coordination. His body, exhausted from panic, shame, and the emotional toll of humiliation, betrayed him. Each breath came ragged and shallow, a testament to the storm within. Finally he lowered his head, unable to meet his father's unwavering gaze, feeling completely exposed and powerless. Clarence Monroe finally approached, hands clasped behind his back, and spoke in the calmest voice Darius had ever heard. "Darius, everything you've built, every claim of superiority, every act of disrespect, has been undone because you ignored the simplest truths: respect, humility, and foresight. Life teaches through consequences, and you, my son, have learned painfully and swiftly." The weight of those words pressed down on Darius. For the first time in his life, he truly understood the gravity of his father's wisdom. It was not just the phone call, the alerts, or the orchestrated consequences. It was the precision, the patience, and the calm authority that had executed them. All at once he saw how fragile his arrogance was, how easily his pride could be dismantled by someone who understood true power. Outside, the first signs of neighbors peeking curiously through blinds hinted at the public nature of Darius's downfall. Clarence had ensured that lessons extended beyond personal humiliation. They were now visible to anyone who might witness the consequences. Darius realized with a pang of terror that his carefully curated image had evaporated, leaving only the raw truth. He had been reckless, disrespectful, and naive to the depth of his father's capabilities. Time stretched, minutes feeling like hours. Clarence Monroe remained silent, watching his son absorb the full measure of consequence. He had no need to shout, to gesture dramatically, to mete out punishment physically. His calm, his patience, and his wisdom had achieved far more. Darius's sobs grew quieter as the shock of reality sank in, replaced by trembling reflection and reluctant understanding. Finally, Darius spoke, his voice barely audible. "Dad, I didn't realize, He trailed off, choked by the magnitude of realization. Clarence nodded slightly, understanding that words were not enough. The lesson had been delivered through experience, consequence, and reflection. The remainder of the morning passed in silence. Darius remained on the floor, eyes downcast, hands trembling, body exhausted. Clarence sat at the kitchen table reading a newspaper, occasionally glancing at his son. Each glance reinforced the unspoken truth. Authority does not need to be loud, strength does not need to be forceful, and consequences, when delivered with wisdom and precision, are inescapable. By noon, Darius had begun to rise, moving with hesitance, humility, and a newfound respect that had never existed before. He looked at his father, long grey beard catching the sunlight, and for the first time truly understood what it meant to face someone whose patience, intelligence, and wisdom were formidable beyond measure. The tears, though waning, still traced lines of remorse and realization across his cheeks. Clarence Monroe finally broke the silence. "Darius, this will stay with you forever. Let it shape your choices, guide your actions, and remind you that arrogance, disrespect, and impulsivity come at a cost. Learn, grow, and never forget the consequences of your actions." Darius nodded, swallowing hard, unable to speak. The lesson had been delivered. Humiliation, loss, and fear had worked as instruments of clarity. He understood with painful precision the reach of his father's authority, the weight of patience, and the power of calm strategy. The day wore on and Darius remained in reflective silence, humbled, reshaped, and irrevocably changed. Clarence Monroe returned to his quiet routines, but the lesson lingered in the air, palpable, indelible, and unforgettable. Darius knew he had been defeated not by anger, not by force, but by the quiet authority of a man who had mastered patience, foresight, and the power of deliberate action. By evening, Darius stepped outside to see the neighborhood, the world, and himself with new eyes. The man who had shouted, thrown water, and insulted his father now understood the profound lesson of humility. And though the sun set, casting long shadows across the driveway, the weight of consequence, justice, and poetic reversal remained, an invisible but undeniable force, guiding every choice he would make from that day forward. The day had ended. Arrogance was broken. Pride had been humbled. And a father's quiet, precise action had delivered justice, not with violence, but with timeless wisdom, strategic patience, and unshakable authority.